Well, let me welcome everyone here for this great celebration, the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm Ben Cardin, and I have the honor of chairing the U.S. Helsinki Commission. I'm joined today by my distinguished colleagues, Alcee Hastings, the co-chair of the Helsinki Commission, Steny, the Majority Leader of the House of Representatives, Senator Sam Brownback from Kansas, the ranking Republican member of the Helsinki Commission, Ambassador Scharioth from Germany. We welcome him here. Ambassador Boda joins us from Geneva. It's a pleasure to have him with us. I also welcome the ambassadors from Romania, Slovak Republic, and Hungary. I see Max Kampelman here, the former ambassador to OSCE and one of the champions of the Helsinki process. Spencer Oliver, the Secretary General of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. It's wonderful to have all of you gathered here today as we really do celebrate a major milestone in U.S. history. Like many of you, I was in Berlin when this wall stood, a functioning blockade that separated brothers and sisters, east and west. In 1987, I went on a Helsinki Commission delegation to Berlin, and from a helicopter, traced the path of the wall as it divided a city, a country, and a continent. In my office, I have a photo, now 20 years old, of Myrna and me hammering at the concrete beneath graffiti art showing a crossed-out hammer and sickle. I was with Congressman Hoyer at that time, Chairman Hoyer, and I remember it was a very cold day that we were knocking down part of that wall. But I tell you, the torch of freedom kept us all very warm that day. It was a great moment in my lifetime and a great moment for freedom around the world. For 28 years, this wall served as one of the most tangible manifestations of the Iron Curtain anywhere in Europe. Hundreds of people were killed trying to flee the grip of communism. Many lost their lives, suffering under the crushing, suffocating weight of totalitarianism. The peaceful opening of the gates of this wall transformed a continent, and yes, it surely changed the course of history. But that moment did not invent anything new. Rather, it reconfirmed what people the world over have always known in their hearts, that being free means being able to do more than gather in a basement or whisper of your political thoughts. Today, we celebrate the fall of the Berlin Wall again. We remember it was a free press that asked the questions that November day that led officials to say the gates would open that very night. We remember it was tearing down of this barricade that allowed an East German woman the chance to rise to the highest office in a free and united Germany. Chancellor Merkel, of course, addressed the joint session of Congress yesterday, and we were commenting a little bit earlier what a motivating speech she gave about not only the significance of the fall of the Berlin Wall, but what united Germany means for freedom today, standing up for the rights not only of all of its citizens, but standing up for the rights of all world citizens to freedom. As it turns out, of course, it's harder to build a free and democratic society than some might have anticipated. Post-communist countries have faced nearly endless challenges. Removing the vestiges of a vast secret police network, addressing complex questions about accountability and transitional justice, trying to return wrongfully stolen property, rehabilitating prisoners of conscience, and moving from command to market economies have all been extremely challenging. None of these goals have been fully accomplished, but they have been the right goals, and the United States has stood and will stand shoulder to shoulder with those seeking to advance them. As President Reagan said in Berlin in 1987, we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advancement of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. More than that, human liberty is essential for economic prosperity. To this end, the United States must make an unambiguous commitment to human rights, not as a personal belief of any political leader or simply an administration policy, but as a moral obligation of our country towards international law and universal principles. The United States understands well that the road to freedom and democracy is an unending path. The journey is the destination. We continue to struggle to make our country better, to acknowledge and heal past wrongs, and to improve the lives and well-being of all our citizens. We know that these are now the goals shared by a larger community of nations, and we are heartened and strengthened by our collective commitment. Whether we are looking at Burma or Cuba or China, we will be more successful when we work together to advance the shared commitments. I know that several groups represented here today have worked hard, in fact, to extend the reach of freedom to an ever larger expanse of the globe and to prevent modern walls from emerging. At the United States Helsinki Commission, we've worked to keep a spotlight on places where people still live under the long shadow of this wall 2 days after its fall. And the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has played a critical role in monitoring human rights, press freedom, and democratic elections to continually encourage states to respect and uphold the rights and dignity of their people. In the last 20 years, we've watched Germany rise as an economic power on the world stage and play a central role in multilateral institutions, institutions that now need to be strengthened through more active international engagement and cooperation. But whether we're talking about money or militaries, energy or the environment, the central issue of human rights must never be off the table. Indeed, the Helsinki process mandates this concern. It's each country's duty to hold the rest of the participating states accountable for their international human rights commitments. The signers of the final act recognize the undeniable links between human rights security and economic cooperation. And as Andrei Scharioth rightly observed, the final act has meaning only if observed fully and by all parties. The whole point of the Helsinki Accords is mutual monitoring, not mutual evasion of difficult problems. That principle should apply not only among our 56 participating states, but among the larger community of nations. That's why, as we address global climate change, I see our solutions completely intertwined. Seeking alternative energy resources creates jobs and builds energy security, and more transparency in the oil and gas industry can lead to greater accountability and improved human rights. When we let multi-billion-dollar deals between energy companies and oil and mineral-rich countries transpire in secret and do not demand transparency, corruption becomes a norm, and we hurt the very people we are trying to help. When countries and companies have to disclose their revenues, the people are empowered and the market becomes predictable. Information and transparency creates a ladder poor communities can climb up to overcome the walls built by their own governments. The knowledge of what the government made selling its natural resources lifts up all people. If glasnost and the Soviet Union helped bring down the Berlin Wall, we must demand a new spirit of openness and redouble transparency to bring down the remaining walls of the 21st century. Working together, inspired by what occurred 20 years ago, I am confident that we can tear down the remaining walls that divide us and build bridges to prosperity, security, and human rights, the cornerstone of the Helsinki process for all the people of the world. Thank you all very much. I noticed that we've been joined by Ambassador Shifter, the former Assistant Secretary for Human Rights and a strong proponent of the Helsinki process. It's a pleasure to have Ambassador Shifter. It's now my pleasure to introduce the chairman of the Helsinki Commission. Now, many of you know him as a very effective congressman representing the southern part of Maryland, or perhaps you know him as the majority leader of the House of Representatives, or perhaps you know him because of the incredible work that he has done in passing significant legislation, whether it's helping people with disabilities or improving voting rights and voting opportunities. But I think we all here know him as the person who gave hope to people who lived behind this wall, gave them the hope that the world was listening. In 1989, he was the chairman of the Helsinki Commission, and he's been an inspiration to all of us, our colleague Steny Hoyer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Senator Cardin, one of my closest friends in life. He and I have served together since 1966 in one capacity or another, in the Maryland General Assembly and in the Congress of the United States. The Commission is indeed fortunate to be led by Senator Cardin, Congressman Hastings, Senator Brownback, and who's Senator Dodd? Senator Smith. I want to say that I'm also pleased to be here with someone who was there at the beginning, someone who started the Commission and made it a viable instrument for change, and somebody, frankly, who convinced Tip O'Neill to appoint me to the Commission many years ago. My friend Spencer Oliver, who now is of course, as all of you know, the Secretary General of the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe Parliamentary Assembly. Spencer, thank you for the leadership you have shown for some 4 decades on behalf of this critically important institution. Thank you very much. I also want to welcome my colleague, Congressman Don Bunker. Spencer and Don and I were all active in the Young Democrats together just a few years ago. Well, everything's relative, I suppose, but I'm pleased to be here with them. And certainly, Ben has mentioned Ambassador Max Kampelman and Secretary Richard Shifter, 2 giants of the Helsinki process. 2 giants who have, for all of their lives, not just within the framework of the Helsinki process, but all of their lives held high the torch of liberty and justice and human rights and commitment. And we owe them a great debt of gratitude. Spencer carried Ambassador Kampelman's bags in Madrid. Well, maybe he says he did more than that, but Max, I know the truth, and I want to thank you for your leadership. I also want to welcome all of our ambassadors here. My friend, Ambassador Boda, but more importantly, his wife. His wife wrote me a letter, and then we had an opportunity to talk. Ambassador Boda had showed great courage in speaking out for justice and freedom in the face of a despot named Ceausescu and a Romanian government that was visiting violence on those who had the audacity of hope, as our president says, and the audacity and courage to disagree. Ambassador Boda is here. We had a wonderful lunch so many years ago in Vienna. And I wasn't sure why we had the lunch, but when I got there, Ambassador Boda talked to me about the role that he thought I had played in making sure that A, he stayed alive, and B, that we worked towards freedom. Ambassador Boda, I will never forget that lunch. But I will never forget either your wife's entreaty on behalf of her husband, but also on behalf of all those who were similarly situated. So I'm so glad that you're here. My friend, Ambassador Scharioth from Germany, who is here, as Ben Cardin indicated, Chancellor Merkel. What an extraordinary story, how timely it is. Ambassador Merkel, of course, Chancellor Merkel, behind this wall, locked behind this wall, estranged from all of us behind this wall. How appropriate it was for her to speak to us yesterday. In late 1988, before I do that, I want all the present members and former members, if you're standing, just sort of wave your hand, of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe to please stand. And if you're standing, raise your hand. Please, I want all of you to stand. Dick, come on, was member Max? Come on up. Hey, stand up, you guys. Jane and then others, I want you to stand up. Marlene is waving her hand. I want to say that those of us who serve in an elected capacity are very extraordinarily advantaged by the incredible staff, some of whom Spencer Oliver hired. That's how long they have served the Commission on Security and Cooperation. He was chairman, he was executive director, Spencer was, of the Helsinki Commission in 1873. He began his term. All of you were much younger when he hired you, but I was so advantaged. And I know I speak for Ben and Alcee and Sam and all who have served with you, that we are honored to have been your colleagues in this effort. America has been advantaged by your talent and by your service, and the world owes all of you a debt of gratitude. Thank you very much. I'm not through. I got another, 10 minutes to go, Ben. I want to, it's not every time that. In late 1988, when I chaired the Helsinki Commission, I listened in a dining room in Moscow, filled with American and Soviet officials, as a Russian dissident named Lev Timofeyev stood and proposed a toast. Not 2 years before, he was chopping lumber in a forced labor camp in the Ural Mountains. Now he was home, and he raised his glass that night to the immediate freedom of, and I quote, all those people whom we are accustomed to call political prisoners. We Americans drank to that, but the Soviets refused to touch their glasses. An uncomfortable moment passed until the editor of the government paper rose to speak on their behalf. And he said this, quote, if we are talking about innocent people who were falsely convicted, well, he said, I can support that. And then the Soviets drank as well. I don't want to overstate the gravity of that moment, but it was expressive. The distance across that table lay between those who believe that every political prisoner is innocent and those who believe that some words and some thoughts are worth prison. Neither side won over the other that night, but the editor of the state paper made an important concession, that some prisoners had been unjustly convicted, that there was such a thing as innocent man in a labor camp or an innocent woman in a labor camp. That innocence, they concluded, mattered. And from the regime behind the purges and the show trials and the gulag, from the regime that gave terrifying meaning to the word disappear, those words truly carried weight. The fall of the Soviet Empire and the fall of this wall was to a great extent the result of such small concessions. Not necessarily dramatic, but continuing, a continuing focus. Piled up bit by bit, and of the brave men and women who elected them, or elicited them, and called the empire to account for them. When the Soviet regime signed the Helsinki Accords in 1975, and Gerald Ford had the courage to sign it, notwithstanding the right wing's attacks on him that it was selling out to the Soviets. The Soviets believed that they had scored a great diplomatic coup, and that the provisions committing them to respect human rights and freedom of conscience would be an afterthought, easily ignored. But inside the Soviet bloc, they were not ignored. And they were not ignored by the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. They became a rallying cry for those with the bravery to push their masters to live by what they had signed. From the Russian dissident movement to Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, to solidarity in Poland, to heroic men and women like Andrei Sakharov, Elena Bonner, Natan Sharaysky, Václav Havel, and so many others who are not as famous, but who were as courageous. As Havel said to the joint session of Congress, and I quote, we knew a great deal about the enormous number of growing problems that slumbered beneath the honeyed, unchanging mask of socialism. But I don't think any of us knew how little it would take for these problems to manifest themselves in all their enormity, and for the longings of these nations to emerge in all of their strength. The Helsinki Accords were central to that awakening. As the historian John Lewis Gaddis observed, the Helsinki Accords, he said, meant that the people living under communist systems, at least the most courageous, could claim official permission to say what they thought. And when that permission was denied, those men and women could point to the signatures of Leonid Brezhnev of the Soviet Union, Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania, and Erich Honecker of East Germany, and all the heads of the states of the Soviet bloc, promising otherwise. In my work with the Helsinki Commission, it was my privilege to add my voice to that great calling to account, as all the members of the staff did as well. And frankly, some wrote those words. To press for to halt to ethnic oppression in Bulgaria, or to speak for the freedom of worship in a movement in Russia, or to plead for the freedom of Ambassador Boda from prison and execution in Ceausescu's Romania. And it was my joy to watch with the world as this wall eroded and then crumbled. And then we took those hammers to that wall. If I had a hammer, the song goes, we had a hammer. In this wall, whose exuberant graffiti and blank concrete face sum up the terms of the struggle so well, we saw communism die as an ideal before its body died. Those who were forced to set up this wall had promised so much: equality, plenty, brotherhood. But they delivered only what Orwell called the prospect of a boot stamping on a human face forever. They called themselves revolutionaries, but they acted out one of the oldest human urges, the urge to dominate our fellow humans. The Helsinki process was a voice in opposition to that domination. In this wall, we saw a system that could entrap, but not entice. When it stood, this wall stood for the division of Europe. But in the battle of ideas, it was also the gray flag of surrender. Now it is in pieces, and I'm proud to have one. But through the destruction of this wall, through cranes by the young men and women with hammers and chisels, was one of the most joyous images of which Ben has spoken earlier, of our times. Ronald Reagan and George Shultz, two of the most committed to tearing down this wall. Ronald Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Ronald Reagan articulated those words, but the efforts behind those words were thousands and thousands of people whose names we will not know, and thousands of people whose names we do know. Some gave their lives. All gave their commitment. The wall is the darker side of that picture. In the fragmentation of this wall, let us remind ourselves of the oppression diffused across our world today. That's why Sam and Alcee and Ben and the staff and all of us still work. The oppression diffused across our world, no longer summed up, is in as potent a symbol as this wall. Young reporter from the University of Maryland Capitol News Service asked me, what was this wall? It was a symbol, a powerful symbol. Nobody saw the Iron Curtain come down because there was no Iron Curtain except rhetorically in Winston Churchill's remarks. But the wall was a real, tangible, touchable symbol. And when it came down, it was a powerful expression. Part of this wall, however, still exists. It exists in Rangoon, where Aung San Suu Kyi sits under house arrest. Part of this wall is in Pyongyang, where school children are forced to memorize songs in praise of the dear leader. Part of this wall is in Beijing, where young students cannot use the internet to discover what happened in Tiananmen Square on June 4th, 1989. Part of this wall is in Afghanistan, where girls were attacked in the face with acid for the crime of wanting an education. Part of this wall is in Saudi Arabia, where men were beheaded for the crime of being gay. Part of this wall is in the hearts and minds of terrorists who imprison their own people behind vengeance and violence. Part of this wall is in Darfur, where millions have been subjected to dispossession, rape, and genocide. Part of this wall is in Tehran, where Nida Aga Sultan was shot in the heart for daring to ask, "Where is my vote?" And part of this wall, as Dante observed, is in the reality of good men doing nothing in the face of evil. Part of this wall is here in America to remind us to keep the faith with those shut behind each wall. On this anniversary, we pledge again to keep that faith and to remember that each wall, no matter how tall or how fearsome, is ultimately an act of surrender, an admission of bankrupt promises. Just as we did 20 years ago, we aired our voices to the great calling to account, with faith that our voices will be heard, that those walls will shake and they will one day fall as well. We keep that faith because, in the words of Bobby Kennedy, each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or speaks out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, they can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. They did it. We've done it. We need to keep doing it. Thank you, Helsinki Commission.
The piece that Congressman Hoyer has in his office, I was with him, he knocked off this part of the wall, so that's where it was. We've been joined by G.K. Butterfield, a member of Congress and serves on the Commission. It's a pleasure to have you here. And what Congressman Hoyer did not mention is that when he was chair of the Commission, he visited just about every one of the countries that was behind the Iron Curtain. These were difficult trips. I joined Steny on several of these trips, but to give hope to people. We don't know all the names of the people we met with. We met with a lot of people who were somewhat, didn't matter their names, but they were seeking freedom, and they were just wanting someone to speak out for them. And under the leadership of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, we offered that hope, and it did help bring down this wall. So I'm very proud of the leadership of Congressman Hoyer. My co-chair of the Helsinki Commission, Congressman Alcee Hastings, has achieved something that no one else in America has done in our participation in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and that is he has become the president of the Parliamentary Assembly. What a commitment that was, and what a message it was as far as U.S. participation and importance in the Helsinki process. I'm proud of his leadership on human rights issues and his leadership on so many other matters that are important to people seeking freedom around the world. Congressman Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank all of you for being here. I additionally would like to thank all the staff and the facilitators here at the Newseum. This is an extraordinary facility. It really, really is. And added to that, I would like to thank our personal staff in our respective offices, as well as at the Helsinki Commission. Standing here today with this concrete icon before us, the images and lessons of history are inescapable. From the guard tower, where officers had shoot to kill orders for anybody trying to escape the East, to the stark contrast in coloring on either side of this barrier. The fall of the Berlin Wall is truly one of the finest chapters in freedom's history. A few inches of concrete form the line between a world of free expression and one of repression. And now, 20 years later, it stands as a bold testament to the fact that a people empowered to express themselves cannot be contained. The march of freedom cannot be stopped. Seeing the liberation that took place in November 1989 resonated with me personally. In my lifetime, I faced my share of walls. The walls of a segregated South, the walls of lingering racism and discrimination. But I overcame, as did many, Jim Crow's walls to become Florida's first United States District Court federal judge. And then, along with two other members, the first African American in Congress since the post-Civil War era, 129 years. And I stand here today in this building amid the ballot box that brought democracy to a land of apartheid, bombed out signs from Sniper Alley, where journalists covered Europe's worst massacre since World War II, and here by the largest piece of the Berlin Wall outside of Germany, to remind us of how far we have come and the work that remains to uphold the dignity of all regardless of their background. I'm happy to see that as of last month, we have a new Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor in Michael Posner. But I'm disappointed that the position was filled at the slowest pace in 28 years. And this administration has still not nominated an ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. For a president who so strongly supports international engagement and reinvigorating multilateral institutions, I expected better. I know it's early and the agenda is long, and Steny has to leave here and get back to healthcare all the time, as do all of us. But I hope we'll have an ambassador nominated at least by this year's end. The events of 1989 showed the power of civil society to spur change through the exercise of fundamental freedoms of expression, assembly, association, and movement. And because of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, we now live in a very different and better world. And while personal and political freedoms have greatly expanded throughout the OSCE region over the last 2 decades, some countries continue to limit these basic rights. In particular, I'm concerned about backsliding of a free press and places where political and ethnic minorities are blocked from participating in civic life. Across Eastern Europe and Central Asia, press freedom is too often lacking. Discussing the region recently, the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, Klaus was direct. The Iron Curtain is still here. As long as journalists face unjust fines and penalties designed to literally halt the press is not free. And if journalists continue to see their colleagues kidnapped, beaten, or killed with no sincere pursuit of the criminals, the press is not free. Our politics can get nasty in this country, but you never see anybody thrown in jail just for running against an incumbent. Today, in too many places, we still see rampant political repression, perversions of the electoral process, and scare tactics used to marginalize those who simply seek to add a new voice to their country's governing process. And Steny, thank you, and Spencer, and Ben, and Ambassador Kappelman, and those, Ambassador Shifter, and those before you. I stood just a moment ago with Mrs. Boda, who I'm meeting for the first time. But I've known her husband for a significant number of years, not as long as Steny and Ben, because I'm younger than them. But Mrs. Boda said to me that it was the work of this commission and those in the United States that she attributes to her and her husband being alive. What a testament on a day that we are here. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've seen new walls erected. Right now, Russia is building a virtual wall in what is internationally recognized as Georgian territory, escalating its effective annexation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Elsewhere, walls are isolating minorities, and even here, keeping out immigrants. I've never been convinced that fences make good neighbors. And for a world endeavoring to lift up its people, walls are hardly a sign of progress. The success of nationalistic parties which campaigned on messages of hate in this year's European parliamentary elections concerns me. The violence and systemic exclusion of Roma and Sinti is nothing short of scandalous. Don't get me wrong, historic progress has been made, but we are not done. And our country has much work to do as well. For our country to advance freedom around the globe, we know we must advance it here. This wall did not come down so that we could build new barriers, and those who fought for freedom in the East did not struggle so that their sons and daughters would have to take up their fight anew. We at the Helsinki Commission pride ourselves on giving voice to the voiceless, providing a forum for human rights defenders who often lack even the slightest megaphone for their cause. But like the activists and artists who painted this wall, like them, we too know something about people power. We know a community galvanized for good, fighting for freedom, cannot be stopped. And wherever such defenders of liberty rise up, we will stand up to join them. Through your words and through your work, I know you will be with them as well. Thank you very much, and thank you, Chairman Cardin.
Alcee, thank you very much. Alcee is continuing to provide extraordinary leadership on these issues, including taking the principles of Helsinki to our Mediterranean partners, an area of the world that can very much benefit from these issues. Senator Sam Brownback provided extraordinary leadership to the Helsinki Commission as chair of the Helsinki Commission, furthering the work of our commission. He's also been one of the leading voices in the United States Senate on human rights issues. He has spoken up on behalf of human rights violations around the world. He is the leading spokesperson in the United States Senate for internet freedom in those countries that are trying to deny its citizens access to information. I'm proud to work with him on the Helsinki issues. He's a good friend and a great leader, Senator Sam Brownback.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate that very much. I understand the House just got called for some votes, so those of you... yeah, you'd think the majority leader would be set that. So it wasn't them protesting my speech getting up. It was them called for votes. What an extraordinary event this is today, and what an extraordinary time. And it just seems so striking to me, I can't imagine that it's been 20 years. It seems like it really, truly was just yesterday that all of us were fighting against this wall and pushing against it. My own memory of this is as a bit of a younger man than several of my colleagues that are here, but is in 1977, going to the Soviet Union as then an officer with the Future Farmers of America. And we were on an exchange program. And one of my colleagues that was with me at the time, we were all 20, 21, was saying, I've heard there is a Baptist church in Moscow, and I want to go see it. And they all denied, said, no, there's no Baptist church that's in Moscow. That doesn't exist. He says, no, I've read about it. I've heard about it. I know it exists. I want to go see it. And they continually denied it, said, no, nobody believes in God here. There's no Baptist church in Moscow. Well, she insisted, and eventually they did yield, and we went to a Baptist church in Moscow in 1977. That was a packed crowd that was in this Baptist church, standing room only. People for a 2-hour service standing, and I was sitting there just being chided in my own mind, thinking about how much I complain about a 1-hour service, and if the pastor goes over 5 minutes, how I think that's too much. And people were standing for a 2-hour service and using handwritten hymnals that they had copied their own songs in the hymnal to be able to sing, and that we were probably putting them in jeopardy by virtue of going there. And I thought how terrible, how extraordinary, and how awful that a system would have that sort of limitations on an individual's freedom of conscience. But as much as that was the situation then, it's a far different situation now. However, remembrance alone of what it was like then cannot serve as limits on our obligations today. As we celebrate 20 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we must also rededicate ourselves to tearing down those walls that remain standing and the new walls erected in the 21st century. And several of my colleagues have spoken quite eloquently about those that exist today. Of those that still stand, held over from the days of the Soviet Union and spread beyond its borders, no wall, I believe, does greater damage to the spirit of the individual, even today, than the oppressive wall against faith. A wall that I witnessed in the former Soviet Union that unfortunately is still rampant throughout many authoritarian regimes in the world today. In China, North Korea, Iran, Vietnam, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, and others, beyond authoritarian grips, and beyond, authoritarian governments still fear religion as a challenge to their grip on power. It matters not that some of these governments have built great skyscrapers, have paved roads, as long as citizens are denied the freedom to believe and to worship as they see fit, they will still be imprisoned in their own minds and held back from their full potential and their full opportunities. We must pledge to eradicate this tyranny wherever we find it. We must free all prisoners of conscience, not only for the sake of the oppressed, but for ours as well. Faith is one front on which we must engage. Truth is another as well. We must confront the growing assault on truth by authoritarian regimes. Looking at the newest wall against liberty is a cyber wall used to censor and punish voices of truth and information. And we face here a formidable challenge. For while no regime anywhere can stifle the human spirit, regimes can try to blot out pieces of history and facts from the minds of its next generation. For example, there is no inherent ability of a human being to know about the brave democratic uprising at Tiananmen Square unless he or she learns about it. The Chinese government has gone to great lengths to wipe this event from the record. But as individual information exchanges become effortless through fiber and wireless communications, the Chinese government, indeed all authoritarian regimes, must devote ever more resources to maintain their electronic walls. In Iran this past summer, the real battle took place on the streets, yes, but it's also still taking place and was then on blogs, Facebook, and Twitter, as Iranians struggle to tell their story while the regime desperately tries to block access to the internet. The same was true for the Burmese opposition in 2007, where the junta struggled to contain the fallout from its bloody crackdown. And before that, text messaging played a crucial role in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. One thing is clear: while physical brutality will always be a tool of oppressors, the tyranny of today and tomorrow will be measured by the extent to which tyrants censor and suppress access to electronic information. As the next generation inherits a globally and an instantly connected planet, the struggle for liberty will be waged with fiber optics as much as with firepower. By resolving to help citizens combat censorship, we will ensure that the more the oppressed see and understand the real nature of their regime, and the more they share with the outside world, the more power they will have to determine their own future. As we commemorate this 20th anniversary of the breaking of the Berlin Wall, we must gather our strength and commit ourselves to finding ways to tear down the walls of the 21st century. Our duty is to scale these walls wherever we find them. Our mission is to make freedom of conscience and free access of information universal. Our work did not end 20 years ago. It does not end today. Today we dedicate ourselves to a new and hopeful beginning, to see a more peaceful and prosperous and open and truthful future. Thank you. God bless you.
The freedom of information certainly is one of the great tools of democracy, and I congratulate Senator Brownback for his strong commitment on this issue of information and access to information. I think it's a critically important part of our struggle for international democracy. So thank you very much for your leadership. Ambassador Scharioth, thank you for being here. We thank you very much. This is a very busy time for you. Whenever you have your leader in a country, I know that it presents real challenges for the ambassador. So we thank you very much for joining us. This is a special time of celebration on the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, and we thank you very much for gracing us with your presence, and we welcome your comments.
Senator Cardin, Senator Brownback, colleagues, ambassadors, Ambassador Kampelmann, remember you well, Secretary Schifter, dear friends. First of all, Senator, thank you very much for having me. This is a great honor for me because November 9th, 1989 was one of the greatest days of my life. On that day, the wall came down, a wall that not had only divided a city, a country, Germany, but a whole continent, Europe, and it had also separated friends and also families. My own family, part of them lived, I grew up in the West, but part of my family lived in the East, and so on that day, also the separation of my family came to an end. So I'm very grateful for what happened. Let me just make short comments on three things. What happened in 1989? Why could it happen? And what followed from it? It was that the wall came down on November 9th, 1989, was the result of a peaceful revolution. A peaceful revolution in East Germany. People, courageous people, took to the streets. First, just a few, church-related. Then, on October 9th, 1989, it was 70,000. And they, of course, had to be afraid that something would happen, but they were courageous enough to do it still. And every week, these numbers grew. And by November 4th, it was 500,000 who assembled in Berlin at the time, and the pressure became huge, and that was the main first reason that the wall came down. The other reason was that we had at the same time a development in Europe. We had Solidarność winning the elections in Poland. We had Hungary opening the border to Austria, and thus also allowing people from East Germany to finally, via Prague, get to Germany, to West Germany. And we had also the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. We had a movement all over Europe in that fall, and that, I think, is very important to remember. It's all over Europe, not just in East Germany. Why could it succeed? Why could it succeed as in 1953, when more than 1 million people took already to the streets in East Germany, but the Soviets got their tanks out of the barracks and they crushed it. In 1956, you all remember that in Hungary, the same thing happened. The Soviets got their tanks out and they crushed the demonstrations. In 1968, the same happened in Czechoslovakia. And in 1980, we all know that Solidarność, of course, had then martial law succeed. So what's the difference? There were two reasons why 1989 was different. The first was in the Soviet Union, we had a leader, Mikhail Gorbachev and Eduard Shevardnadze, who decided not to use force. And that was one of the differences, because in 53, in Germany, 56, 68, it had always been crushed by force, by tanks. But the other reason, and that's why I'm so glad to have been invited here, is Helsinki. And Helsinki was much more important than people believed. Because in Helsinki, we had, in the final act, the right for peaceful change of borders. We had in it the right that every country could choose its alliance. And we had in it also the right that journalists could come to the East European countries and field a report. And that made the difference. In 1953, people in the GDR believed it was just happening in Berlin and in their hometown. They did not know that it happened all over the country. And that's why they couldn't unite their forces. And in 1989, everybody in the GDR knew what was happening, because the West German television had its reporters there, and they could report. We had it on television, and everybody in the GDR watched it on television. And so, why could it succeed? Because of Helsinki. Because of the Helsinki process. Because in 1975, the Soviets thought they had gained a huge success by stabilizing the borders. What they did not think about is the revolutionary power of what we at the time called Basket 3. The human rights, the rights of the press, and that made all the difference. Now, what followed from it? First, the unification of my country, and here I would like to say a word of huge gratitude to the United States. I myself was in this process which was called 2+4. Immediately in the beginning of 1990 it began, and it led to the unification of Germany on October 3rd, 1990. And I know what I'm talking about. I know that without the steadfast support of the United States in 1990, we would not have been able to really reunify our country. We would not have been able to make use of this window of opportunity which was there just for 1990. Because don't forget, already in November, Edward Shevardnadze stepped down, and so the window was not really much longer than what we had. We were very grateful for that. I will never forget that, and I think the German people will never forget what the United States did in 1990 and in the years before, when the spirits were low, when President Kennedy came to Berlin and said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," and in 1987, when Ronald Reagan said, "Tear down this wall, open this gate." This is not forgotten, and we will never forget that. We are very grateful. But it followed from it also the unification of Europe, because the Berlin Wall was not only dividing Berlin, was not only dividing the whole of Germany, what people sometimes forget, because it was a wall right through Germany. It divided Europe, and we could then reunify Europe, which had been so totally strangely divided in 1945. And I'm very proud to have my friend Adrian and many others here who are now members of the European Union, members of NATO, and that, I think, is what we celebrate. And there's one more lesson which we learned from this huge events of 1989. If the people of Europe and the United States, if they unite, if they have the same aim, if they have the same goals, we can do almost everything and anything. Success is unlimited, and I think that was also the message of my Chancellor yesterday. You remember, she lived on the other side of this wall, and I'm very grateful that you celebrate that. Thank you for having me. I thank for your work.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for those comments. I think you underscore the importance of the power of the people. And as the numbers grew on the eastern part of Berlin, the inevitable occurred. And I think, you know, when we lived through a major moment in history, I don't know if we really recognize how significant it was. And I think today, looking back 20 years ago, what happened in Europe, it was a remarkable triumph for the principles of Helsinki. And I appreciate your bringing that to what we tried to do as an international community in 1975 with the Helsinki process. It's still relevant today, as you point out. And I think we can learn from history, we can celebrate today, and then dedicate ourselves to make sure that we are as effective as possible to help people around the world who need our action. Let me again thank you all for joining in this celebration. I particularly thank our ambassadors for being here, and we look forward to our continued effort to speak out on behalf of all people. Thank you.